Xenoblade Chronicles is a game developed by Monolith Soft which released for the Nintendo Wii in 2010. It received a remaster called Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition in 2020, which is the edition I played for this video. The game was a new step in the broader Xeno franchise, starting with Xenogears, developed by Square for the PlayStation, and the Xenosaga Trilogy on PS2, which was Monolith Soft's first project as a company. I had wanted to play this game for a long time. Since I first saw Shulk in Super Smash Bros. Brawl and played on that frustrating map, I was entranced. His cool looking red sword that seemingly gave him the ability to tap into different strengths, it looked cool. So in 2024 I began playing Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition on my Nintendo Switch. I had an amazing time with the game, but my experience was littered with many delights and many frustrations. I find it a profoundly interesting game to think about and critique, so join me as I take you through my thoughts on the game. Let's explore the depths of Xenoblade Chronicles. The game begins with a bit of exposition. We learn that the world comprises two giant beings, dueling for as long as time in an endless ocean. The Bionis, representing life and nature, and the Mechonis, representing machines. This is instantly grabbing. It is such strong visual style. I love this setting, and we'll dive into the strengths of it more later on, but for now let's just continue with the opening. Eventually the battle ends with two decisive blows taking out each other. Now the gods lay dormant, and life has sprung up on the Bionis. But as it did, something rose within the Mechonis called the Mechon. We jump ahead to a war between the two in a place called Sword Valley, a large area on the sword of the Mechonis. The human-like race called the Homs clash with the Mechon. We play as Dunban and are given a tutorial on the game's mechanics. He wields the legendary sword the Monado and takes down machine after machine. The opening does a good job establishing the world's conflicts, while providing a closed-off setting to teach you the core mechanics. But once we finish up with this opening and set some things up for later, we jump ahead to the true protagonist, Shulk, a young boy with a heart for tinkering. We start the game proper with him digging through some broken parts to find anything salvageable. We are slowly introduced to the world around him as we watch his daily routine. We meet with his friends Rain and Fiora, and find out that Shulk is attempting to study the ever-fussy Monado, so he can learn how to use it in a fight against the Mechon like Dunban did. While there are some troubles, life is good in Colony 9, until the Mechon unleash a sudden attack. In the struggles, one of the particular strong Mechon kills Fiora. Shulk vows to destroy the Mechon, so him and Rain set out to find the metal face that killed her and put an end to him. I've skipped over a couple of details, but this is basically the setup for Xenoblade. The war between Bionis and Mechonis, with the primary focus of Shulk's desire for revenge. I'm gonna give my thoughts on the rest of the story more broadly later, but for now let's just discuss where it all takes place. Xenoblade Chronicles is an open-world RPG, where you freely run around these massive locations. Enemies and NPCs litter these large vistas, all with quite seamless connections. You're able to fast travel easily to most areas you find. You receive experience for finding new fast travel spots, which is a great incentive to stray off the beaten path whenever possible. I really can't overstate just how gorgeous this game is. Each and every area is breathtaking, with these amazing views you just don't get tired of. The concept of making your way around this continent-sized beast is also just such a fun framing device. Moving from its knee into its body and through its lungs, then out onto its shoulder. It's a remarkably creative setting for a game, and it breathes so much life into the world. Easily the aspect that leaves the biggest impression overall. I don't really know how to discuss it any further than just gush over the idea and execution. I love it. Many creatures wander around this beautiful world. When you engage with an enemy, you enter combat right then and there, so let's discuss the battles. Xenoblade has quite a unique gameplay style that is a little infamous for being daunting at first. But really, it is far simpler than it looks. Taking after similar mechanics in MMO games, when you engage in battle, your characters automatically attack. You have a bar at the bottom of your screen with a list of various abilities you can select from. Each one has a cooldown that has to be finished before being able to perform it again. The abilities have different uses and attributes. Most have some sort of extra condition or ability on top of just basic damage or buffing, with certain conditions to be met in order to achieve the better effects. Every character in the game has a large list of abilities that unlock as the game continues on, which you can also pick from to use in battle. I was most impressed with how well constructed each character's role is. Shulk is a pretty straightforward character, but is also used to introduce you to most of the mechanics in the game. He does start with some very simple abilities, such as Backslash, and continues on without much complexity. Backslash just deals a ton of damage, but it deals even more damage from behind an enemy. When you first receive this, you'll want to do that every time. But taking another mechanic from MMORPGs, enemies have an aggro. They will focus on whoever is dealing the most damage to them or spamming the most arts, but there are a number of abilities to affect that. So your first moments in battle will be spent running in circles around an enemy and getting annoyed that you can't get behind it, but your friend Rain will likely use some taunting skills to pry the monster away from you, and your reward is a satisfying hit. By the end of the first battle, you've been taught to keep a careful eye on who your enemy is targeting, what possible methods can be used to change it, and how rewarding it is to pay attention. Shulk also quickly gains 2 more skills to give strong bonuses when you hit an enemy from the side. Using these simple building blocks, the game is able to produce a ton of interesting mechanical depth, while seamlessly explaining all of it to the player in an instant. Rain, who I mentioned earlier, is a pretty archetypical tank. He has a lot of skills to help him gain aggro from enemies. He can switch between various auras, which either make him more defensive or demand more attention. But he also has the first topple ability you'll find in the game, which introduces another mechanic. Some skills are in pink and apply break to the enemy. It only lasts a little while and doesn't really do much by itself. But if break is still applied and enemy gets hit by a green topple skill, they'll be downed, completely immobile, so all attacks are guaranteed hits, with bonuses to types of crit chance and things like that. Later in the game you can even take it another level further with daze as well. This is already a useful mechanic, but it is made essential when fighting mech-on enemies in the early game. It swiftly introduces the idea of different enemies needing different strategies. It also notably ties in story details for these enemies. It really helps demonstrate the threat the mech-on represents. Only Shulk with his legendary one-of-a-kind blade can actually hurt them, unless you put a lot of effort into making them vulnerable for just a moment. It is a nice way to implement narrative elements in the gameplay. You've just been told how threatening and dangerous the mech-on are, and you actually get to feel that when your party members are practically useless against them, struggling down to just take 1 or 2 despite being some of the best fighters in the village. But it does actually bring me to one of my biggest gripes with the gameplay. You're able to actively play as any of your party members. This is a pretty awesome feature, adding so much variety to the moment-to-moment action. Each character has an entire set of skills to unlock and upgrade, each with pros and cons. They play shockingly different, and you're able to construct them best to achieve their goals with a number of mechanics we'll get to later. It's not like they're ignored either. Most of your other party members are actually more mechanically complicated than Shulk is, rather than maybe being a bit more simple while Shulk is your main character. But my problem with this is that you're actively incentivized not to experiment with your other party members, instead relegating you to who is by far the most simple to play, Shulk. Shulk does a lot of damage. He will never stop being your primary damage dealer. Leaving that over to the CPU is just not really an option. The AI is not good enough at optimizing their attacks, and it will dramatically lower your overall DPS. So if you really like playing a support character, you're basically gutting your damage potential to do so as a party. Then this problem is made so much worse when you consider the Monado skills. As Shulk, there are 2 unique mechanics that are core to the game's experience. During the game, Shulk receives various visions of upcoming story situations, and that ability also applies to the gameplay, allowing you to plan ahead for strong enemy attacks. You're given a small cutscene and information hangs on the screen in quite an appealing way, telling you what sort of move it is, who is getting hit, and for how much damage. But most of the time there isn't much you can actually do besides preemptively healing the character, which only helps sometimes. Instead it mostly relies on the other skill Shulk has over everyone else, the Monado skills. As the game progresses, Shulk's control of his sword grows. As such, he gains new abilities, through different symbols that appear in the characteristic gap in the Monado. At first you only have the Buster skill, which is just a high damage attack with a multiplier against mech-on enemies. But some that are gained later, like Shield or Speed, are the only ways to counter the incoming attacks your visions warn you of. This is a core part of the battles, and is very satisfying to pull off, but it means you basically can never do any important fight playing as any other character besides Shulk. His skills are far too indispensable to trust the iffy AI with. Now, what frustrated me the most about all of this is that the solution is just so simple and so easy. One little fix and my biggest problem with the gameplay would vanish. Just let me change character during a battle. Let me press a button to switch control from party member to party member, something akin to Final Fantasy VII Remake. I can switch to Shulk in order to throw out a backslash or use the enchant skill, then go to someone like Rain to grab aggro and inflict topple, or maybe jump to Melia to apply some buffs to my party. This would be immensely satisfying. It would help justify each and every aspect of the game, give you more control over your party interactions, all without trivializing the difficulty. It's not like the game really relies on you being unable to switch characters. It wouldn't ruin the pacing of fights that much at all. But as things are, you're basically stuck with Shulk, or you can experiment with someone else and barely engage with half of the game's main mechanics, crippling your strength and ignoring a portion of the gameplay. It's such a weird problem to have because I genuinely don't understand why it's like this. Because as much as I do love the unique RPG mechanics, Shulk gets a bit boring to play. His moveset is not going to change much over the 50 to 60 hour long experience. And while the Monado certainly adds some more depth to him, you need to build up charge to use any of those skills, so for a majority of the time you're just going to be waiting to backslash again. But there is another mechanic that on paper could help alleviate some of these issues I'm talking about, but in execution, I'm still really torn on. Every now and then you'll be able to pull off a chain attack. Time slows to a halt and you can pick any of your arts. Each character in your party attacks one after the other, and occasionally you can attack one or two more times after it as well, depending on how you perform with the QTE. It basically acts as a big coordinated strike. Now, you might think this solves the problems I was mentioning earlier. By using a chain attack, you can easily set up a break into a topple. You can choose the arts used by other characters, or you can play with someone else and do your high damage with Shulk. But here's the complicated part. Each attack has a different associated color, and by using arts of the same type during a chain attack you get a multiplier. This is a strong incentive to just spam the same type of attack, usually red ones, over and over. Now on one hand, this helps justify the mechanic. Without it, there wouldn't be too much use to it. Attacking 3 times in a row isn't that strong, since you almost always have 2 or 3 arts available, and the rest will be available in just 2 seconds. With this multiplier, you can do some incredibly high damage, but it kind of makes you not want to experiment with all of your arts. If it weren't for the multiplier, it'd be a lot more fun to use. Being able to apply some debuffs before striking the weakness you just created, or instantly toppling and dazing an enemy. But because of the multiplier, almost every other strategy will never be as effective as just spamming your highest power red physical art. So rather than giving the opportunity to control your other party members without implementing a whole character switching mechanic, the chain attacks almost always amount to just a big chunk of damage then returning to normal. But it is certainly fun to use, and who doesn't like strong attacks? And like I said, if you are playing as someone else, it can help alleviate the lack of strength you get from not controlling Shulk. It's not like it's poorly balanced, it's just the problem of incentive. You're incentivized not to experiment, not to try out more unique skill synergies, and not to make use of your other characters. Just make Shulk's backslash stronger because anything else won't be worth it. But don't let my big rant convince you that this means the game is at all bad. I truly support the new places this game takes its combat, and I'm incredibly excited to see how it's iterated in the rest of the series. It has a lot of room to improve, but it's an incredibly strong foundation. It has the depth and interesting interactivity through the importance of positioning and things of the sort, but that's just the act of combat. Anyone who's played an RPG knows you spend about as much time in menus as you do in battle, so how are those mechanics in Xenoblade? I was incredibly satisfied with the character building aspects of this game. There are 3 main methods to improve your characters: skills, arts, and equipment. Each character has 3 different skill trees that you can select. Whichever tree is currently equipped will receive SP after battles to slowly unlock whatever skill is next in line. These bonuses vary wildly. Some change what kind of equipment a character can have, different buffs received at the beginning of battle, or improving their healing and damage in certain ways, with all sorts of other examples in between. There are a few different types illustrated by the shape of icon, whether it's a circle, a square, a diamond, or a sort of star shape. But what starts to make this mechanic a little special is the second menu in the skill tree. This brings up a large menu that is tied directly to the affinity chart, which I'll go into more detail later about. But just to quickly explain, affinity is the level of your character's relationships. By raising two characters' affinity level, you unlock slots. You can fill these slots with skills from that other character as long as it fits the slot type and you have the right amount of affinity coins. Affinity coins are a simple resource that limits how many strong skills you can pile onto your character. They do feel a bit arbitrary. The affinity level already paces out how many skills you can add, and even when you unlock those slots, you're still limited by the slot type, which sometimes leaves half of your unlocked slots still open, because you just don't have any of the right skills to equip. So the affinity coins do kind of feel like another layer of complication that really isn't necessary, though I suppose you would be able to make your characters a bit too strong without them, heavily depending on the order in which you prioritize skills. It's hard to say. Regardless, it's a great system. It gives you 3 main paths for each character, which helps give the player more choices for how you use them. Then with the affinity chart, you're able to customize even further, and you're rewarded for getting characters to spend time together and helping each other out. I always love RPG mechanics that tie relationships to character skills. It is a perfectly simple but effective way to marry a game's combat and story, which makes the whole experience feel so much more cohesive. It always bothers me when the story is only present through cutscenes and dialogue, especially in an RPG where the characters are so important. But things like this really helps everything mix just that much better. Next we have the arts. We've already partly covered these. Arts are the abilities you use in battle. Like I said before, you unlock new ones as your character levels up, and eventually you have to pick which arts you actually bring into battle with a limited set. You can also upgrade your arts with AP that you gain after fights. There are 3 tiers of upgrades, each of which have 3 of their own levels. At first you can only upgrade it 2 times before needing to unlock the next tier. You can do this by buying books from various sellers around the game world. I found the pacing very off with these. Some upgrades were completely unlocked in like 15 hours, and others I couldn't find the final books for even in the end of the game. I didn't want to use a guide to find them, but I had still checked like every store I had access to, and it didn't even feel like it was easier to get the weak abilities and harder to get the strong ones. It was just kind of at random. I'm not sure how much thought was put into the order in which you get these books, but I could also see my own experience not matching up with everyone else's. But besides all of that, it does feel good being able to upgrade your arts. Watching their effectiveness grow as the game goes on feels satisfying, and it's nice seeing the tangible difference of damage, or healing, or length of whatever effect, rather than the somewhat invisible and less gratifying slow build of stats. Finally, there's the equipment, a pretty standard staple of the RPG genre. Equipment is sorted by weight, which bars certain characters from some items. Usually this is done by a certain class gating off types of equipment, but this works just as well, especially since there are a few times you can actually change someone's maximum gear weight throughout the game. One thing that is absolutely appreciated despite the lack of gameplay significance is the appearance of all equipment. Every piece of armor and weapon has a model, and you can actually see it on your character. I love this sort of thing, it's so fun. You can also separately set the character's costume if you have any specific preferences. I don't feel the need to describe in detail how equipment works, especially since the game doesn't do anything particularly new with the mechanic. What I do want to talk about are the gems. Throughout the world there are these crystal piles you can mine. Each different color corresponds with different stat types. You can then go to an ore refinery and process these into gems. There's a cute little minigame that luckily doesn't overstay its welcome. Each gem you produce provides a stat effect. There are different levels that signify the strength of the buff. You can then insert them into slots in your armor and weapon to further customize your character's build. They vary from increasing buff timing, providing health whenever you deal damage, decreasing aggro gained from arts, stuff like that. There are just too many to count. It's a fun mechanic and just adds that extra little bit of spice to the standard equipment styles. I always love having to decide between a chess piece with 1 slot and higher defense or 3 slots with lower defense. It's an interesting choice to make, and my answer changes all the time depending on the situation. Overall, there's a ton of customization and character building mechanics. I always believe this is one of the biggest determining factors for quality in an RPG, and Xenoblade seriously does not disappoint. I always felt rewarded for delving into the menus and fine-tuning my characters ever so slightly. I certainly have my gripes with some of these systems, as I covered. It ultimately adds to my central point that this is a flawed but interesting experience. It experiments in so many ways, which I think is far more valuable than a proper execution. Of course, I love well-executed but largely safe games, though these weirder ones are the experiences that I think about long after I finish them, and that's really what I want at the end of the day. But now that we've gone over gameplay, I want to dive back into the story for a bit and discuss my thoughts on it. So I'm not going to go over many narrative points in detail. I want to preserve the experience for anyone who still might want to play the game without having the core aspects spoiled. Instead, let's cover things a bit more broadly. I think easily the strongest aspect of the game's story is the characters, which interestingly was also what I thought was the worst part of it at the beginning. At first, everyone just kind of feels like a standard trope. Shulk is slightly more interesting, but he's still a very stock standard protagonist with a goal of revenge. I was a little demotivated with how obvious most of the story is in the first quarter of the game, but quickly the characters begin to grow on me. Relationships develop, and it feels like there's some proper self-reflection and development from everyone throughout the whole thing. I would say the main themes are still very tropey, but I love the trope of friendship, and my favorite trope is the importance of the human spirit, which is shown in great detail here. Like I said before, the creativity is absolutely all in the setting. I like the story, but it will not really catch you off guard or have you considering things from a new perspective. Not every story needs to do that, and I think this more than does the job. Again, the highlight is the characters. As the cast continues to expand, the strengths of them really begin to show. My personal favourite character is Melia, who has an interesting narrative about her role as a princess and the political expectations put on her by her unique birth. The narrative has a good flow to it, with the goal always being clear. There aren't many moments where it's dragged or slowed down. It kept me guessing, tied narrative threads together with a satisfying frequency to keep you hooked. Overall, I found myself increasingly engaged with the story as it went on. While at first I was mostly dismissive, by the end I found a pretty solid, archetypical JRPG narrative set in what might be my favourite video game world I've ever played. Now the final main topic I want to go over is that world, the game structure, how Xenoblade ties all of these disparate elements together, or in some ways, fail to. Like I went over earlier, the game takes place across a large series of maps. Some are safe zones with no enemies, just like NPCs, stores, and many side quests. The side quests in this game are hilariously bare bones. Almost all of them are impossible to separate from parody. Gain some items, kill some enemies, talk to someone, like that's it. The narrative elements surrounding these side quests are usually just as weak, usually with like 2 or 3 lines as context at best. But as simple as they are, I don't think they're poorly executed. It's pretty damn easy to mash through the meaningless dialogue for one, so you never get bored stuck with droning on NPCs. One element I'm a big fan of is that enemies you need to kill for a quest or drop quest items are highlighted as you walk around. An exclamation mark hangs over their heads to inform you of their importance. I found it a genuinely smart way to pace XP gain and battle frequency. It's very easy to avoid battles if you want, unless you're in a dungeon, but by just fighting the enemies related to quest, it keeps you in a pretty good sweet spot regarding your level. Once you complete the quest, there's rarely a need to ever return to the quest giver. If you're told to kill 3 wolves, and you kill them, you get your rewards then and there on the field. The only quests you do need to return to the quest giver are the ones where the objective is something incredibly nearby, so you're still in the area anyway. I think it's all quite intelligent design. The side quests are simply there to better pace your progression, provide rewards, money and gear throughout the game, and incentivize you to engage in some random battles without it feeling forced. The only problem is that it's at the expense of actually high quality side content, but for a game like this, it's not in desperate need of more padding. A lot of the quests revolve around picking up items in the area. At every location in the game, there are small glowing pickup spots. Just walking past them, you instantly collect them. There are countless different items from each different categories. They can be used for quests, given to party members to raise affinity and to fill out your collectopedia to gain even more rewards. But now let's go back to that affinity chart. You can build affinity between characters as well as build affinity with the entire communities. Each main hub area you come across has its own presence, and you can raise its affinity by completing quests for the locals. It's also the easiest way to gain affinity between your party. Your equipped characters will chat with each other and the quest giver anytime you pick one up, giving them hearts to eventually raise their level. While the party levels up fast, the location levels drag on. It takes a while, honestly, way longer than what I feel is reasonable. You're expected to live in these places a lot more than I ever feel is necessary or enjoyable, but I'll get into that later. The affinity chart unlocks skill slots for your characters, giving you access to more skills from whomever you're getting closer to emotionally. Higher affinity means better results and different abilities when gem crafting as well. It's a nice little system reminiscent of something like Persona or Fire Emblem. I think every RPG is made better by my party getting closer with me and each other in the gameplay and the narrative. Reaching higher levels with your party also unlocks various heart-to-heart events. These are small cutscenes in which two characters talk, learning more about each other. There are dialogue options which provide the opportunity to gain even more hearts to further to your infinity. It's a nice little narrative design that gives some much needed break time with these people. I like seeing their day-to-day struggles, shared memories, and odd little pairings I hadn't considered. They're a little mechanically frustrating since they're quite randomly scattered throughout the world. You can view which ones you're eligible to watch, but their exact locations are a little difficult to ascertain from the menu. But regardless of the slightly spotty quality of life, they are charming additions that bring some well-rounded character moments to each party member, as well as developing the relationships between them, which can sometimes be neglected in the main plot. Affinity with full communities grants you better trade items and deals. You're able to trade with a metric ton of NPCs, but I found it to be a largely useless system. Most items can be found in easier, cheaper, and faster ways, so I never felt incentivized to engage with the system very much at all, which was only made much worse when I started to notice how slowly the affinity level went up with these. I think this brings us to a bit of a dilemma with this game, the nature of the world and how you're meant to engage with it. The world is vast, beautiful, and well designed, but in a lot of ways it's also quite empty. There is almost no need to explore beyond wherever the story is directing you. Quests never require anything from you besides picking up random items on the ground and defeating common enemies you find. This isn't a problem though. If the game is designed to only engage with the world on a surface level, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. The issue is that it's inconsistent with whether it wants you to really live in the world. We just talked about the affinity chart, which names all sorts of NPCs and even gives information on them, which is shocking depth for characters you barely interact with beyond skippable quest dialogue. The affinity system asks you to care about the NPCs, which is hard to do when you can only do so much with them. There is another system I love in theory, but find more frustrating than anything else in practice. Colony 6 is a location the player arrives at early in the game's story. It's been destroyed by the Mechanists, leaving the residents to escape as refugees. But eventually some of the characters will start to come back and rebuild. Throughout the game, you can return to Colony 6 and provide various materials and money to upgrade different aspects of the town, from the number of residences, shopping streets, or the more unique special category. I love this, honestly. I love having a place that grows with me as I progress, as well as having an external entity to pour my extra resources into. You gain access to new trade options, it consolidates the endless random NPCs around the map, you get new quests, new items to buy, all sorts of things. I really adore it. But I did not end up doing very much of it. Part of it is my own fault, but I would say part of it is the game. Each upgrade requires a few resources, usually only a handful of 2 different types, and then a bit of money. But my problem is that they're usually such hyper-specific materials that you have no way of locating if you missed out on them besides an online wiki. Now, I'd found some of them along the way, but ended up selling them as well. There is a mechanic to prevent this sort of thing from happening. When selling materials dropped by enemies or picked up around the world, a red exclamation mark will notify you if they're needed for an active quest, and sometimes Shulk will have a vision that tells you you'll need this material for a future quest, which is signified by a blue check mark. But because some of them are marked as important, you're told it's safe to sell the ones that aren't marked at all. and usually they can only be found by like one enemy type in one location at one time a day. If you've passed it, then you're not going to know where to look. I found myself running around aimlessly for like 2 whole hours just to get a few little upgrades I was already way too far in the game to make any use of. It was upsetting not being able to enjoy this mechanic as intended because I either sold or completely missed materials hours before. The rewards are solid enough for it to be worth it, but only at the intended point of the game's story you can get them. If you go a chapter further, they'll already be rendered pretty useless, and you still have to work through them to get to the things that are at your level. But this is the best example to show the game's divergent world philosophy. I'm expected to gain all these materials as I go, maybe only going back to find like 1 or 2 missed things away. But I found it almost impossible to keep up with these mechanics without spending a few extra hours per map to round up every possible item. But god, that'd be boring. I had a wonderful time just going about at my own pace. I really love this game, but I felt this feeling of FOMO over and over again, that I was missing out on equipment, gems, story, and mechanics that I could only experience if I let my game time double in length. I'm willing to acknowledge the obvious effect my own personality and mindset had on my experience. I don't feel this is a universal truth about the game. I'm sure others played similar to me but didn't feel pulled between the short and long-term investment like I did, and then others delved into each and every corner of the game without getting bored at all like I would've. I just wanted to share my experience through this beautiful title, and explain what about the game design led me down this weird little road of annoyance. To cap off this video, let's go over the edition of the game you've been looking at the whole time. Xenoblade Definitive Edition is a remaster of the game released a decade after the original release. Still handled by Monolith Soft, it featured a large graphical and UI overhaul. It streamlined some small mechanics, but all in all, it's still relatively close in line with the original. It does not feature any of the additions made in the 3DS port, which is an obvious shame, though I don't think the Amiibo and Street Pass features massively change the gameplay experience. Additionally, there's also a new epilogue campaign called Future Connected. It is a tasty little 10-hour story taking place after the original game's events, mostly centering on Melia. It has a few slightly different mechanics to better fit the structure, but overall it is not drastically different. I think it mostly serves the purpose to provide some new content for returning fans who have already played the original to death. Evidence of this is the fact that you do not need anything to unlock it, and it can be launched from the main menu the moment you boot the game up. I think the most notable change is the art style. The original features a far more unique visual language that is best suited for the poor hardware of the Wii. While I'd argue the environmental designs and overworld textures are a straight upgrade here, I can't say the same for the models. They're very pretty, and I like how the new version looks, but it is undeniable that the original has a beautiful art style that has been sacrificed for a generic anime look that's more in line with Xenoblade Chronicles X and 2. It gives the franchise more visual cohesion, which is valuable in its own right, but I think it's reasonable to mourn the original style in its more characteristic glory. Well, that's all I really wanted to say about Xenoblade Chronicles. I really love this game. I know I focus a lot on the negative, but that's because I feel I had more interesting things to say about those aspects. The story and gameplay really grew on me as the game went on. I adore the bizarrely interesting MMO-like RPG mechanics and battle system. It's a game I recommend to any fans of the genre, and I could not be more excited to experience how the series develops in X, 2, 3, and whatever Xeno franchise might come next. Thank you very much for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed.